Welcome everyone to the July live event for our DEI Leader Network. This month's topic is attracting, hiring, and retaining employees with disabilities. We are incredibly fortunate to have three subject matter experts who we will introduce in a moment with us today. A few administrative notes: because of the number of people on the webinar today, we've muted everyone. But we welcome questions and comments at any time during the presentation. So please use the chat feature or raise your hand button, or use the raise your hand button, and we'll do our best to accommodate. We have saved some time at the very end of the webinar for questions for a Q&A session. So if you prefer, you can wait until then. What is the DEI Leaders Network? Well, it's a monthly forum for those assigned the responsibility or have interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion in their workplace. We have found that the role of DEI professionals can be really lonely in most organizations. Unless you're lucky enough to have a team of people, DEI leaders often shoulder an enormous amount of responsibility on a really difficult topic. This network, the DLN, is intended to give informal and formal DEI leaders a community to lean on and learn from. Please invite others into the network and join us for future events every Thursday of the month. We believe that diversity, equity, inclusion is the right thing to do, the smart thing to do, and more relevant than ever. And today's topic really falls within our across our 15 dimensions of diversity for organizational performance. If you look within strategy, it's part of workplace composition, climate, and culture. On our internal dimension, it's part of talent acquisition, onboarding and retention, employee engagement and wellness. And then for external, it's definitely part of marketing and public relations. I also would like to think that it's part of, it's integrated into every dimension here on our chart. But those are the ones that I've highlighted. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our managing partner, Holly Wittenberg, who is our data analytics lead and our resident geek, to provide some context before we begin the panel discussion. Holly?
Thank you. I wear the hat of nerd. I'm just going to quickly give you some context for at least the US population, and I think this will ground the discussion helpfully. So a lot of public data sets are available to help you understand individuals with disabilities in the United States. 42 million, or 13% of Americans, are living with disabilities. Some of those are visible, some of them are invisible. And the chart that I've included here, which we'll include in a follow-up set of resources, even shows you the distribution by age. What you will notice is actually a good number of people, and it makes sense, right, are 65 or older. And so that disability could be age-related. Some portion of them will be. And then it also distinguishes the type of disability in addition to offering you the age range. So I think that'll be a helpful resource for the people following up from this call. So how does the US government define and the law define an individual as having a disability? They either have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or they have a history or record, something like cancer treatment, right? And this is the law that defines disabilities for the purposes of discrimination. And then the third bucket is being perceived as having an impairment, such as somebody who has scars or burns. The EOC has a wealth of terrific resources, which again we'll include in our tip sheet, and there's a link there below. And then in summary, again, for context setting, 12% of Americans are disabled. They represent 3% of the civilian labor force, and but that's not really speaking to the opportunity, because 8% are unemployed compared to 3.5% overall. And 77% of Americans with disabilities are not in the labor force. So this 8%, those are people that want a job, right? So there's some people that are not active members of the labor force, but there's still a very large number that are seeking employment, and that's what we want to focus on today. So if you recall in the previous slide, we said 12% of Americans are disabled, but it varies greatly from state to state. So understanding your backyard, your operating area, that context is always really important. Disabilities can be congenital, or they can be clinical or medical. And what's interesting to me, having worked in the healthcare field for a long time, is how much this mirrors the health outcomes map in the United States as well. You see a higher rate of people with disabilities in the South, in places like Tennessee and Kentucky as well. But again, this is also an opportunity for you to understand the potential labor market and the opportunities to hire people with disabilities in your states. So why don't people have jobs? That 8% unemployment? This is a great analysis from the EEOC. And what I want to focus is where employees can lend a hand, right? So 11% lack transportation, 10% have a need for special features at a job, and 8% it's about employer coworker attitudes. Now, 79% granted are because of the individual's own disability. But what we want to showcase here is that there's great opportunity for improvement where the employees can really lend a hand. And last but not least, we just want to highlight that there's actually a lot of tax credits available for employers that do hire individuals with disabilities. We are not tax experts, and we are not lawyers, so consult your own attorney. But one of our clients that operates in order fulfillment out on the West Coast really capitalized on this and said that they earned a couple $100,000 every year in tax credits. So this can be very substantial. And I think where I want to end before I turn it back over to Rachel is this is why thinking about DEI strategically is so important, and not thinking about it tactically. If you come up with a plan, if you understand the tax benefits, if you create a strategy and you execute against that strategy, you're really going to not only get the benefit of having talented employees with diverse backgrounds, but you could potentially have an immediate drop to the bottom line. And that's why we advocate for that strategic approach at Diversity Works. Thank you, Rachel, for the opportunity to share my numbers, my love, and my love being the numbers, not Rachel.
Thank you, Holly. I really appreciate it. I think it's important to set that context so that we have a broader understanding as we begin sort of the personal exploration and workplace implications of employees with disabilities. So before I move forward, I want to take a moment to introduce each person on the screen right now who has been spotlighted. We have two ASL interpreters, Suzanne and Wanda. And so thank you so much for sharing your expertise in interpreting for us today. I'd like each panelist, Anessa, Elizabeth, and Janet, to introduce themselves by sharing who they are, the work that they've been doing, and what inspires them to work in this field. So we'll start with Anessa because your name begins with A.
Sounds great. Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. My name is Anessa Powell. I represent All Ability Recruiting. I'm the founder and CEO of that. Before I begin into my background, I just want to mention that I am a white woman with blonde hair. I am wearing a bright pink jacket with a white shirt. Diving into a little bit further about All Ability Recruiting, we specialize in what I like to say, all things disability employment related. We have recruitment, as well as training and consulting for your company or organization. And why does it mean so much to me? It's because it is personal. I am a person living with a disability. I have a non-apparent disability, a rare disease, a rare autoimmune disease. And I actually grew up with a father who had a traumatic brain injury. So I am well versed in the world of, but you don't look sick from the outside, and what that means when it comes to employment. So it means a lot to us, especially with all ability recruiting and our commitment to our candidates first, being seen for the talents that they can bring to any company or organization. On the flip side, helping companies recognize that talent and seeing for the individuals for who they are. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Elizabeth.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Rotter Shramenko. I am as well an ASL teacher, creating content and learning ASL for everyone, for students. I work at a company named Lingvano, and I'm here in Vienna, Austria, in Europe. It's the headquarters here, the capital. This is the sign for Lingvano. I am the only deaf person in the organization. I develop a learning curriculum and film production for and with the team for Lingvano ASL apps on the internet. So far, since 2019, we began our ASL learning here at Lingvano when we established, first for hearing people and also for deaf people. I was the first employee hired to begin this work, and I'd like to share. We have actually many deaf people who want to work, to be employed, but they don't get hired for various reasons. Many employers are afraid or not sure how to work with deaf people because it is a visual disability as well. They have different communication styles. They use their hands. It's a visual communication, and employers don't have enough information on how to interact, so they're afraid, and that's mainly the reason. And we like to share how to hire deaf people and employees who are motivated to work. So that's my background.
Thank you. Janet.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am Janet Lebrecht, and I am an African-American female with shoulder-length hair. I have a navy blue jacket with a white printed blouse underneath. Thank you so much for the invitation today here. This is really an important topic that is incredibly relevant. And so I think it's great that you've had such a great turnout for today. My personal background is that most recently, I am the founder of Synergy Consulting Partners, which is a consulting firm. And we do work with corporations, we do work with private and nonprofit organizations, we do work with the National Vocational Rehabilitation Programs. And our work primarily involves partnering with agencies and organizations and corporations to support them in their endeavor to be inclusive, but also we work on performance, both organizational performance and agility for providing services to the disability community. I'm also the former commissioner for the Rehabilitation Services Administration, and I was appointed in 2013 by the Obama administration to oversee all of the national vocational rehabilitation programs, the client assistance programs, during the time when I was there, independent living programs, migrant seasonal farm workers programs, which have both shifted those last two to other federal programs. So personally, I am totally blind. I have a condition that is progressive and that led to total blindness, retinitis pigmentosa. I am one of 4 of 6 siblings who are all diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa. So for me, this issue has really been a lifelong lived experience with losing my vision very slowly. So I understand, what that entails, but I also know that individuals in the disability community, regardless of the disability, have a great deal of subject matter expertise, lived experiences, and willingness to be both inclusive and collaborative in the effort to help organizations as well as corporations to really be inclusive with hiring individuals with disabilities.
Thank you, Janet.
Mhm.
And my name is Rachel Gomez Peterson. I am the program manager at Diversity Works, and I am a biracial woman, half Asian, Filipino, and white. I have medium length dark hair, and I'm currently wearing a blazer with a white shirt. So let's get into it. We'll start with recruiting. I was wondering, speak out, whoever the question moves you to speak, but what proactive steps can organizations take to actively recruit and attract a diverse pool of candidates with disabilities during the hiring process?
I'll happy to go first, Rachel. As I like to joke, that's a lot to unpack, but it's so much worthy of unpacking it. Honestly, from the very beginning, for a company to attract and retain, you have to start at the very beginning when it comes to the application process to your website, and then going from there from the very beginning. Are you talking about it? Are you mentioning the word diversity in your DEI strategy? Is it mentioned on your website? Is it mentioned in your company values? Is it mentioned in many places? It can't be just mentioned one time out of the year. Whether you pick it July as being Disability Pride Month, or in October when it's National Disability Employment Awareness Month. It can't just be twice a year. It has to be ingrained. It has to be something that is the culture. The culture is important. And when you want to attract those employees that are coming to you and they feel like they can disclose to you their disability and they feel comfortable in disclosing that, that is what's going to make you stand out from the rest of the crowd. And there's a lot more that I can share, but I just want to start off with that one and let the others have a chance to respond.
Elizabeth or Janet?
This is Janet. I also think those were very good points. And I think in addition to that, I think that it's also important to not only examine the language that you're using, but also to examine your own organizational culture from within. And your own organizational culture really does send out messages. It sends out messages to your employees. It sends out messages to executive leadership, and it also sends out messages externally. And so by examining, any organizational biases that may exist, the language that you may be using in those applications, the relationships or partnerships that you may have external to your business, I think is absolutely critical, getting to know who is in your community. And I think importantly, it's important to also emphasize that I'm always saying to people that we don't expect you to be the all-knowing and the subject matter experts in areas that you may not be. But I do think that we do have the expectation that if you don't have that those partnerships and those relationships that you forage in your respective areas can be extremely meaningful and impactful, and that you use those opportunities, to have others examine what your processes look like as well. Invite people to give you feedback so that you have a better understanding and a more objective understanding and perspective about what you're putting out there, regardless of whether it's language or what you're excluding. And so I think that that's also important.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yes, so I think, for example, a company does need to know what they want to formulate in their goals. What is their vision and what their ideas are. So for example, in my company, we had the vision of creating a curriculum for sign language diversity. So not only American Sign Language, but Austrian and British Sign Language. If you can provide these different opportunities for people to learn various sign languages, then there's more ability to communicate with deaf people across the world. And so building that bridge between the deaf community and the hearing community to make those connections, not only within your family and friends, but in the workplace and with your employers, that is a great opportunity. And that is something that we wanted to show as an inclusive environment, that language and communication can be open and can be diverse, not only just people with disabilities, but people with, maybe Black people, Asian people, different cultures, different countries, come work as a team in a collaborative environment to show that diversity and that positive attitude and working together. And that should be shown in your recruitment, in your websites, in your job postings, the language in your job postings. Like, for example, for an ASL teacher, make sure you demonstrate that we're looking for that diversity. Also in recruitment, looking at within the deaf community as well, using Facebook is a great way to advertise for job opportunities and create opportunities for interviewing as well.
Janet, you had talked about unconscious bias. I'm wondering, can each of you speak to how organizations might mitigate any unconscious bias or assumptions that may exist within their recruitment processes, ensuring that there's a fair and inclusive approach to hiring candidates with disabilities?
This is Janet. Sure. I think the interesting thing about bias is that there are individuals, and I think our whole culture, thinks about biases in a negative way. And I think that in some cases, I think that it's important to note that some of those biases are important as they shape the way we communicate, they shape our reactions, and that there's an opportunity here to look at those biases to see, are they presenting in that negative way, and that are they actually excluding? I read an article and it talked about that the human brain really fires very quickly. And so we form associations and we form opinions or biases very quickly, but we're not good at examining what those might be and what the impact might be also. From forming those associations so quickly. We make decisions very quickly about someone's appearance or about, their language, and those types of biases can impact decision-making, they can impact recruiting, they can impact hiring, because we make those assumptions based on what we think that picture in our brain has just showed us. And so I think that it's really important to look externally as well as internally at whether or not you're making some of those assumptions and really examining ways that you can challenge those assumptions and not always think about it as from a negative perspective, but also from a learning perspective.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, do you want to share?
Yeah, so before starting an interview with a deaf candidate, for example, you definitely need to think about, what idea you have in your mind about interviewing with a person with a disability. What are some fears that you might have? Those biases that do come out, make sure you write them down. Think about those fears and biases. What concerns do you have or questions do you have? Then you can actually research it. You can look on the internet. What are these common biases, especially hearing biases against deaf people in general? And you can actually do this research and identify whether or not you relate to those assumptions or concerns. And then you can gather more information about how to, mitigate those concerns. With that information, then you will feel like you're more confident and more comfortable going into that interview. I think that's a really good way to help mitigate those assumptions.
And I think to both your point and Janet's point, it's uncovering the personal bias that we all hold and normalizing that, knowing that we live in a society that has created it, and then to actively work to mitigate against it, to put in the policies and the procedures. I'm wondering, Anessa, if you could speak to like specific policies and procedures that you have advised organizations on recruiting, and also through the recruiting and the hiring process.
Absolutely. You know, first and foremost, the word disability is not a bad word. And I really want to make sure people understand that. I think there has been in the past so many years, the thought of even using that word and what that looks like. Please understand that I am a person with a disability, and there's various ways to describe someone. And you can ask what they prefer, person first language or vice versa. But understanding that if you have met someone with a disability, you have met one person with a disability.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's experiences are so very vast and different. And that's when assumptions really get you into trouble within organizations, that you start lumping certain disabilities together. Everyone has a very, very different experience. And that goes back to the fundamental part of your culture. But how do you change that culture? You start with talking about it, and it cannot be from the bottom up. And it cannot be from the top down. It has to be from the inside out, in which you change the culture within your organization and everyone working together. And along with that is training, having these conversations, uncovering what that means for your unconscious bias, but also covering what you had envisioned a disability is from the very beginning, and breaking that all together. And understanding when you're looking around your workforce, when you're looking around your employees, 1 in 4 people have a disability.
Mm-hmm.
And that not only affects what's happening within your organization, but also your customers and the communities that you serve. So starting there. And the beauty of disability is it's intersectional. So it touches all the other minority groups. And so when you say you are committed to DEI, when you say you are committed to diversity, you're committed to inclusion, you have to include disability, because if you aren't, then you're not doing it right. You're not doing it correctly. And that's just showing your commitment is not fully there. And it's a matter of changing the narrative over time to fit that need, and working together. Like I said, not top down, bottom up, just from the inside out, everyone talking about it, having the training. And when you have the training, it's not something that you have one day, you get the paperwork, you put it in your desk, and you don't talk about it again. No, you have to talk about it immediately in order to change the conversations.
Yeah. Well, you brought up the idea of intersectionality, and I was wondering if you all could speak to how organizations can proactively address the intersectionality of identities, ensuring that employees with disabilities from marginalized communities receive equitable support and internal opportunities for growth, while being mindful of their, of any bias or stereotypes.
This is Janet, and I think one of the most important ways that they can do that is to not live within your organization with preconceived, views or policies and practices that may have been in place for a long time. And policies and practices don't always have to be in writing, that it can be in practice. So, and what typically happens is that when they're not addressed, right at the forefront, that how an organization practices on a day-to-day basis can sometimes be interpreted as policies. And that is really, really difficult to navigate once you've done it and then try to undo it. And so a good example of that would be, for example, how individual workplaces conduct their training. Are they providing accessible materials? Not only the materials that should be accessible, but the event itself, the training, the environment, the location, the time, all of those come together to really formulate how the organization has practiced in the past and what they continue to do. And sometimes it's really tough for organizations to think about changing how they practiced, when in fact, it's really good to think about that. It makes the company more agile, it makes your workforce more agile, and it forces people to think differently about how we have conducted business or what has happened. And that you see that a lot around accommodations in particular. So I think that it's really important to examine those ways that you operate historically. A lot of companies and individuals will think that, for example, with the blindness community, that we all read Braille, for example, when in fact, less than 10% of the population of individuals who are blind or low vision read Braille. And so thinking about taking that assumption and putting that aside and not assuming that everyone who is blind is a Braille reader, then you might want to ask the question and pose that question and ask the question from a position of how can we best support your participation in this training? What would be your most preferred accommodation? And I think that opens up the opportunity for a very different dialogue than making the assumption. I've seen companies do this, and I've seen them go out and have spend a lot of money on Braille, for example, materials, when in fact the individual may not in fact read Braille. And so having that dialogue in the initial phases and making it a general practice to really invite not just the person with a disability, but it's a good opportunity for the company or the organization to really think about how in general they're conducting trainings or how they're using materials. Is there a more effective and efficient way to be inclusive and using a more universal approach to something like training?
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, you're shaking your head. Yes. What thoughts do you have?
Yes. So if a company is considering and wanting, deaf people or individuals, they may need to think about, what are the best practices. Ask that individual, what is it that you need? And, maybe interpreter services, some sort of technology equipment in order to help for, and for example, just those things. But ask the deaf person, they know what they need. And it could be a list of items, it could be just a few items. It depends on the work environment as well, what they need. For example, there's a deaf surgeon internship here at a hospital, and they may require equipment, for example, a screen with closed captioning, and then the deaf person can read the captioning and what a doctor is saying, and then they would have a real-time conversation, and that would make a successful employment experience. It may have other items that they may need, but working together maybe with a computer and a computer office, needing a screen that has just a mirror on it so that they can see somebody coming up behind them, or maybe somebody comes into the room or their cubicle and they would visually know what's happening in their environment. It's the best way. Just ask the person what they need, and that way they would have a more generalized understanding.
Vanessa,
one more thing. And also awareness, for example, of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, having, other people with disabilities and having their rights to receive fair and equal treatment, of other members in the group. So that's what I wanted to add.
Vanessa, I was wondering if you could speak specifically to those who have non-apparent. Obviously, you cannot. I'm not asking you to be the speaker of all those who have non-apparent disabilities, but it seems that maybe there are some certain hurdles that employers need to jump through or have to overcome, to even ask or be aware of someone who has a non-apparent disability. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. And it goes back to that culture piece. Are you creating the culture and the environment where your employees feel comfortable in sharing with you their particular disability if they need accommodations? So with the ADA and the way it is created is that you can interview for a job and you do not have to put the have a disability. You do not have to disclose. If you still disclose. You do not have to disclose at any time. The trickiness comes in when a person has to disclose because they need certain accommodations in order to. And I will tell you on the flip side of that, as an employer, that's where that training is key. Their disclosure matters just 100%. It absolutely matters because the way in which this person may be telling it for the first time can be very vulnerable for them, extremely vulnerable. And it may be the first time they've ever left it. And the person who is receiving it, it absolutely goes to that training piece and understanding. I will tell you, there are a lot of businesses that didn't realize, or they thought they knew that their employees with disabilities and before the pandemic, and now people are starting to return back to the office. And they have people disclosing now that, hey, I have a disability, I'm having some mental health. That mental health piece, let's not forget, is the largest piece of that invisible non-apparent disability. And there is a huge vulnerability factor when someone is disclosing a mental health piece to you and what that looks like. And they may need an accommodation where they need to have a particular day off every once a month, or they need time off to go see their mental health professional. And that is vital for you in order to understand that and to support them. So how do you get your arms around that? You start by having conversations from the very beginning. You start by having the opportunity where you're not just saying to them, how's the job going? Blah, blah, blah. No, really deeply finding out from your teams and your managers to understand that they have created an environment that if they disclose to you, they're not going to be penalized for it, right? They're not going to be overlooked for a particular promotion because they have a disability. You create an environment that it's an equal playing field for all, because that's what you believe in. And that's why you're supporting your employees, regardless of what they're telling you or not telling you.
We actually have a specific question to that point. Not only, how do you ask questions during an interview, if at all? And then maybe, can you give us some examples of questions to ask, once you're hired, even just the phrasing that people might need to overcome the fear of asking about a disability?
I'm happy.
Sure.
To jump. Go ahead. I'll be happy to. So is it the last question that you're referring to? There seems to be a lower percentage of self-disclosure of disability, especially less apparent or invisible by candidates for new hires, that particular one as well. I just want to make sure I answer it properly.
Oh, it was a question earlier in our chat, just specifically about what questions can you ask during an interview? So,
you are bound by laws. You can't ask a person specifically about their disability here in America. If you're from other places, to how those go, and Elizabeth probably can speak better to that than I can over in Europe. But here in America, you're not allowed to ask, are capable of asking what they need in order to perform their job successfully. That's the way, and it's all about how you ask that and say, do you need any accommodations to perform your job? And then that will give you an indication as to the response. So you may need someone who needs a screen reader, and then you have an idea that we might have someone with a visual impairment, or you have someone who is asking for a desk that needs to be raised because they may have a wheelchair. There's various ways to understand. And, we always encourage our candidates to disclose. Like I said, it can be a tricky thing and a vulnerable thing for our candidates to do that, especially if they've never disclosed before. But we always suggest them from the very beginning, right? Then opposed to later on down the road, and it'd be an interactive process where you're trying to meet those accommodations. Some say, well, I don't feel like doing that. And I always encourage those, even with autoimmune conditions, especially because I myself can speak to this. Autoimmune conditions don't like to just stick with one. They like to collect over time. So if you have accommodation that you didn't need when you were hired, but now you do, that's a part of the process too. So there are ways to go about it. We offer training classes where we do interactive process where you go through scenario and what that looks when you are interviewing someone whom is deaf, or someone who's visually impaired, someone who is neurodivergent, and what that looks like in your response and how you can meet that need for them and making sure they feel comfortable through that whole process.
Janet or
And
Elizabeth?
This is Janet. Yeah, I think also another important fact is that organizations and companies, should feel very comfortable reaching out to those subject matter experts that are in your community, especially around employment. There are various organizations. The Vocational Rehabilitation Program nationally is in every state, and they are subject matter experts on hiring and retention and accommodations in terms of what people might need or not need. I think it's also important to remember that accommodations specifically for supporting an individual with a disability may not be as costly as you think. And that, in fact, the studies have reported, that most accommodations are very inexpensive. I think the big barrier comes into place when companies don't know what those interventions might be in order to support an accommodation. And they make an assumption that it is too expensive ahead of time. And I understand that there's really a challenge sometimes for companies because they may not necessarily be a large company, but what really gets in the way is the attitude. That's what is really going to be the determining factor in terms of how they're responding to, even if you suspect that there might be a need for an accommodation. I think it's an opportunity, to open the dialogue with an individual. And I think that also, even before you send out your job posting, that you need to be clear about, what are your needs as a company? Are you as open as you think you are, in terms of and knowledgeable about accommodations? Because if you're posting a position, you are inviting that person or persons to come into your organization or your company to perform a job. And from my perspective, you should really have already have done your homework in terms of looking at what kinds of issues might there be with this position. How flexible are you on the position? Lots of companies make accommodations all the time, and it isn't necessarily related to a disability. If there is a person that leaves the position, for example, you need to accommodate how you are going to get the work done in that particular position. And they do all kinds of things. There is shared work, there's pay, there's leave, there is remote work. The pandemic showed us that remote work indeed is possible. And the disability community was a huge benefactor of working remotely because employers prior to the pandemic did not have the confidence or ability or willingness in some cases to think that people with disabilities could in fact work remotely. We always thought of work as a culture that you need to get in your car, you need to use public transportation to get to your workplace to perform all of the duties that you need to perform. And between the pandemic and the quiet quit, that we saw internationally, that has proven to be the exact opposite.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, so corporations need to provide chances for people with disabilities to know what kind and how to find these opportunities. For example, with a train organization, which is abbreviated NOD, and that example has a deaf group within Gallaudet University, which is a university for deaf and hard of hearing people, and the only one liberal arts university in the world. They can create this partnership. So for example, within the office, when you're working in a specialized field and you're trying to work on recruitment, like, for example, students who are looking for employment or internships, or they had recently graduated from Gallaudet University or alumni, this is a really great place to find those resources. There's other National Institute for Technology. That's another known deaf university. And you can work with organizations like NAD, Americans, the National American Deaf Organization. You can partner with them. You can also work with FERS, which is another organization that has experience working with the deaf community. So there's many, many resources out there that you can partner with so that you can ask questions on how to interview candidates, especially deaf candidates, what they need, what kind of accommodations might come up. Those resources are out there that you can ask for. So you know, as long as you don't ask for personal information, you don't want to ask people, can you lip read? You just ask, what accommodations do you need? What things do you need for meetings within the organization? Do you need interpreters for certain meetings? You don't want to tell people what they need. You just want to make sure that you create that opportunity for people to express their needs, and then you get a better idea of what kind of accommodations they need for that particular person with a disability.
Yeah, I contacted Gallaudet in advance of this webinar, and they had mentioned that they provide services for alumni who've obviously attended Gallaudet. So and they also gave me a list of organizations, and Joyful Signing was one where Wanda and Suzanne came from, but they were open to also translating for you. They just didn't have anyone on staff at that time. But that is a great resource. And Gallaudet was a wonderful, they were so easy to communicate with and so warm and friendly when I called. We have a question in the chat about ways employers can improve their benefit programs for employees and their families with disabilities. I was wondering if someone could speak to that.
This is Janet, and I think this, again, is a question that could also move beyond people with disabilities, and that you could ask that question in general for the workforce. And so companies have a range of benefit programs that are available. And this is, again, why it's so important to have that open dialogue in terms of looking internally at where you may have imposed barriers without realizing it. And in particular, you can look at your benefit structure within your company. And so looking at areas such as flex time. Does your company have a flex policy in general? How is that policy used? How is the language in that policy viewed in terms of is it really a policy that will encourage someone with a disability once the company is aware of that, you know, that they might need that, you know, as an alternative approach to working a 9-to-5, you know, job. And there's you know, many ways that companies can take their benefits if they have, you know, medical benefits, for example, if they have benefits that are related to education, looking even internally at your learning development plans that you may have as part of your company to promote, I think, internal learning, or promote the opportunity for there to be some educational training opportunities for not just the person with a disability, but the company itself, the people who are in HR, the people who are supervisors or managers. And that oftentimes when there is a disconnect in those particular areas, particularly around benefits, that oftentimes it's at the supervisor or manager level where there might be problems with responses and having the opportunity for people with disability to access, you know, some of those benefits. So looking at making sure that you have those benefits in place. Individuals might want to take advantage of a different type of a structure around, you know, their lunch breaks. Individuals who may be diabetic or have another condition where it requires some intermittent or alternative approaches, you know, may need some of that time in a different way that they utilize it. And so looking at your benefits and looking at how those benefits are accessed, whether or not you're unintentionally imposing a barrier for people with disabilities, and I think your general workforce.
Mm-hmm.
This is Anessa, can I just piggyback on that really quickly and saying that, you know, within your organization, are you asking the question in your employee survey that you do once a year and asking, do you have a disability? Do you feel comfortable in sharing that disability? You know, you're going to ask about race and gender and sometimes sexual orientation, but are you even asking about their natural disability group? So you have to start by asking it. Also, do you have an organization or an employee resource group? Have you created one where there is a safe place, not only for those that have disabilities, but also for caregivers? That's a huge portion, or could be a part of your employee workforce, and understanding what that means for them. And that in turn, once you understand, because you're having the conversation, you're having that open dialogue within that resource group, you're having that dialogue because you're asking them what they care about, you could really be surprised by the answer, especially from caregivers, and the paid time off day where they can have the time to take their child to their doctor's visits and what that looks like for them, and not being penalized, because that's something that's very important to them. I think just having that question and that communication, to Janet's point, is vital. And there's something that's been around for a very long time within the community. It's nothing about us without us. So that means including them in the conversation and not making these just broad decisions without ever first having that conversation to understand what is so important to them.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think designing anything without, without the people who it's going to impact is important. And so asking the question, who's not sitting at the table? I mean, it's such a simple question, but
Exactly.
who's sitting at the table, who needs to be sitting at the table? Elizabeth?
Yeah, so companies just like Lingbano in Austria, it's a little bit of a different system than America. But what we provide for benefits programming has, flex time included. There's you can work in the office or you can work from home. There is also with travel that can be included within the compensation or work time. The employees can also choose, like new employees can choose whether they want 1 year free for transportation within the city, so they don't have to pay for transit. There's also e-bike situations where you can pay half of it and the company will pay the other half for using rental bikes. There's also benefits where there's free sign language courses for coworkers that they can take every week from a deaf educator. There is a 1 month or a 1 day only signing. So for hearing employees and coworkers, they are not allowed to talk. They have to sign all day to try and encourage that use of sign language. It's also really great for having that warm, welcoming feeling and inclusive feeling in the work culture. There's also there's free use of the app. So the coworkers and employees can use the app to learn how to sign with their coworkers, and the educators in that app is deaf as well, so they can work with deaf people within the app. So really including that communication differences really makes it a very attractive benefit program.
We have one final question, and then I'd like each of you to think about one resource that you would recommend sharing with everyone to learn more. And we will, just so that everyone knows, we will share the websites of all three of our panelists along with Joyful Signing, so that everyone has access to that information. But the question has to do with, if an employer is requesting proof of accommodations or proof of disabilities, specifically for someone who has a non-apparent, how do you tackle that?
This is Anessa. They have the right to ask for that. As a part of the ADA, and what that means is within company organizations, they can ask for you to show medical documentation to support what you are asking in your accommodation. That is fine. The interactive process involves that for some companies because that's their policy. Our thing on the flip side of that for our clients is when a particular candidate is saying to you and disclosing that they have a mental health condition or they have a non-apparent disability, come from the practice of believing them. Now, I know that that sounds odd, but it is the truth because unfortunately, companies come from a belief person that is and they just abandoned it all. Giving employee the time.
Oh, Anessa,
Yeah.
your sound is off. We missed.
Sorry.
Sorry. Or it wasn't off, it was garbled.
If you turn your video on,
Okay.
it might help with your bandwidth, Vanessa.
I think we may have lost Anessa. Okay, so maybe she'll be able to we've definitely lost her. Sorry about that, everyone. Janet and Elizabeth, in the few minutes that we have left, I'm wondering if you could just offer a resource for our participants.
My favorite resource is Job Accommodation Network. And I will tell you why it's my favorite. It's my favorite because, first of all, it's a free resource, for individuals, organizations, businesses, employers, but also they are really, really good with providing examples, certainly some history on decisions. I think that they are really, really strong in that area, and you should absolutely rely on them because they will also offer, recommendations as well. And so I love Job Accommodation Network.
Job Accommodation Network.
Yes, Jan.
JAN.
Yep, JAN. Yeah.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, yeah, I'm trying to think, for example, closed captioning. So just making sure there's interpreters, using technology and communication with technology. There's Slack, which is a really great way to communicate within coworkers and an organization, which is very accessible. If the interpreters are not here, they should always have interpreters, but if they're not here, you could also use Slack. There's also an app called Asana, which is an Austrian name. It's kind of like a tool for employers to learn about what to do with communication within their organization. And you can use that to type to each other. And that's a really great resource as well. It's very accessible.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very great.
Well, I do want to extend just my gratitude and my thanks to each of you here today on behalf of Diversity Works. I just want to share with everyone that we're preparing for our August webinar on creative budgeting for DEI programs, how to work with other departments to find your DEI dollars. And we ask that that you follow us on all of the social media channels that you can, LinkedIn, YouTube. This video will be posted to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Twitter. So thank you so much for participating. This was incredibly informative, and I hope you guys found it too. All right. Bye, everyone.